Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Just Rusty. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's the final boss of Memetic Hazards. We got a really spicy example for this one. This one's kind of ripping on some of the stuff which came up from Bionicme's recent Parley, which you found really interesting, Just Rusty. They begin, it was mentioned in that video that other players represent a sort of memetic hazard in that playing with other people can reveal ways of playing which undo the game itself. We talked about what to do as a player on the receiving end of Johnny One Shot, as I put it, whose strategy's existence, and you're forced to know about it because they played against you, can alter your perception of the game just by experiencing it. Some brief examples. I will link that Bionicme parlay in the description. I thought it was really good, but we'll talk about the concept enough in this parlay that you don't need to watch that one for this to make sense. You could watch it after if you become interested in the subject. So let me give you two examples. We talked in the Bionicme parlay a lot about how this is related to build systems, but I'm going to give you an example in and not in a build system, just to demonstrate the concept. So, for example, it often happens that in a game with a lot of different options for you to play with, obviously you don't know what all of them are, right? There's usually enough options in the game that nobody knows all builds. Even in games with very small amounts of build options, it's often still true in practice. But you often won't just know offhand, like even just what all of the things in the game are. If you ask me to list what every, mod is in Warframe, I obviously wouldn't be able to do that. Even in a game with a relatively reined-in set of skills like Monster Hunter Wilds, I would struggle to list every single skill. I actually probably could get pretty close, but I'm good at that meaningless skill. I think for the most part, you get my point. But becoming aware or becoming increasedly aware that something exists in the game and has a certain impact on certain strategies you might use changes what the game is. This is something that happens when you add build options to a game. For example, in Monster Hunter Wilds, you can bring two weapons to a hunt. This is kind of like bringing two fighting characters. It's often been said. I really like that analogy. You don't need to use two. You can switch fairly quickly, like 15-20 seconds in combat, maybe more like 10 seconds, I guess. Not right in the middle of a combo, though. So you can use both weapons. I mean, this is a game where you might have a 30-minute boss fight. You might just wish to switch up your playstyle partway through that. But there are other ways you can use your other weapon slot. For example, the hunting horn can play songs to give buffs to you and your allies. And this is a minor memetic hazard I'm going to unleash upon you, but I just think it makes the game a little bit more interesting in some ways. Some of those buffs stay after you swap off of the hunting horn. And so you can, for example, play Earplugs, the song that gives earplugs. This makes you immune to the monster's roars. You don't get stunned. You can still damage the monster or charge up a big vulnerable attack while the monster is roaring, or you won't get interrupted mid-combo. And you can play the earplug song and give you and your allies that relatively expensive to put on your build. It's got a relatively high build craft opportunity cost buff, and then switch off of your hunting horn. And if you have earplugs L, like the longer lasting version of the earplug song, it lasts like 5 minutes or something, minutes, a meaningful amount of time. You can probably fight the monster in that location and it will be there. You'll have the buff until the monster moves on to a new location, runs away. So, well, not for the whole fight, but I mean for long enough that it's definitely useful. I've used this a lot already. That is absolutely 100% definitely a useful thing. It's not particularly hard or time intensive to do, and there isn't much opportunity cost to doing it until you know about other things you could use that other weapon slot for, like having a ranged weapon that has really, really powerful, Wyvern Heart ammo or whatever, ignition ammo, like a heavy bowgun that has a really, really strong, Wyvern Heart ignition attack, and then once it's on cooldown, you just swap off it. Or the monster is airborne now, so you swap onto it, shoot the monster while it's up there, and then swap off it. There are other ways to deal with the monster being airborne, like flash pods and stuff, but this is a way that you can deal with that I think is fairly beneficial. You can use them for status effects, etc. Ranged weapons in general, kind of nice. You can use ranged weapons to do damage to the monster safely while another monster is fighting it. I find this very effective, personally. You run almost no risk of getting damage yourself, and you don't really need to stop. If anything, your damage probably goes up compared to when the monster was fighting on its own, and then you can just swap back to your other weapon when the monster's, not fighting another monster. You can deal with that other ways, like by poo-podding the other monster. A dung pod will just make it run away, but this is an option that provides different value if you wanted to. Again, I think if anything, your damage might go up if you take advantage of the situation that way. So that hunting horn tech has an opportunity cost. It doesn't instantly warp the game just because you know about that, unless you only get told about that one way to use your other weapon slot, but then don't know or think of other ways to use that other weapon slot. And it also depends on player perception, of course. What if the player just doesn't think it's that valuable to get that benefit, or thinks it's more valuable than maybe it is to be able to switch weapons in combat, or simply doesn't care and likes the fun value of switching weapons in combat? You can still fight with the hunting horn. Hunting horn is a good weapon. Anyway, whatever. You get the point. You see what I mean? It changes the game fairly significantly. I have other ideas for your other weapon slot than those, too. I don't think this is a bad thing in the case of Monster Hunter Wilds, but it is something where I think the game becomes meaningfully different if that is included into it. And you can understand how, if the game encouraged you to do this kind of thing, a lot of players would have a pretty different experience than they do in the current form of the game, where the game doesn't encourage you to do this. It neither encourages nor discourages you to use this. One more example, and this one doesn't have a build system. In Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, you can buffer a jumping attack. That is, you can do an attack where you jump and then do the attack really quickly. The attack comes out quite soon after you jumped. By simply hitting the jump button and the A button at the same time, you will jump into the air, and quite quickly after you left the ground, quick enough that unless you practice, you would probably struggle to do it this consistently, you will unleash an aerial attack, kind of near the ground. And if you're using like a swordy character, for example, like a character with a sword with some good reach on that attack, you have effectively gained additional ground attacks without really needing to be very skilled at doing that. Now, they're not perfect. You can do it more close to the ground, which is very valuable to do sometimes if you have more skill, but I don't, and I think a lot of casual players don't. Thus, if you know about this, the game changes a lot, in my opinion, for the better. It opens up characters' kits quite a bit and lets you use a lot more options, like from the ground / on the ground. And I remember when I and my friends who were at a kind of similar skill level, I learned that this was the case and started doing it, and absolutely destroyed everybody else I was playing with, and then they realized what I was doing, and then it was even again, and I thought it was more fun in that case, but it really significantly changed the game. In many cases, my opinion is, and this will be my thesis for the rest of the parlay, I think it's usually better for everybody to just know this stuff and for the game to deal with the consequences of it being the case. I am very against the attitude where players say, like, don't tell anyone about this, because then the developers will nerf it or whatever. It's more like it either ought or ought not to be nerfed, and let's just get that over with. That's better. And if people like a really broken thing, perhaps they would just enjoy a different kind of game that is about having that kind of thing. If this game is or isn't about having that kind of option, then it ought or ought not to have that kind of option in it. And I don't think it's good for those things to just be hidden. However, in the example in this parlay, things are going to get significantly more complicated. Let's continue. But again, my thesis would normally have been, I kind of want players to know these things. And then if that means the developer pursues the game's design goals and takes the thing out or modifies the thing or leaves it in because it's kind of intended, but they just didn't tell people, maybe they should add a tutorial that tells people about this. I personally think that is the better timeline. But I want to ask, Just Rusty continues, what do you do when you uncover a way to become this memetic hazard? I recently became #1 in the world at a game called Manus Dei, Hands of God. It's a game from Oxto developer, Lateralis, and it's in the style of games like Devil Daggers and Hyperdemon. It's got more depth than the former and less barriers to entry than the latter, and is, I think, a really fun entry into this genre of shooter, but probably not something I'd normally bring to Parlay, as it has basically no buildcraft to speak of. I was already top 5, so you were already very good at the game. But then I discovered a way to exploit the scoring system to utterly obliterate the existing high scores. You've included a screenshot where I can see that humorously named number 2 high score slot, Miranda Cosgrove, has a score of 16,000. Number 3 slot, Slapper, has a score of lower 16,000s. There's a 15,000, 15,000, 14,000. So that's what the scores are like in the top 5. And Just Rusty's score is 22,000. So very noticeably higher. Clearly, you are not just a little bit better. You have, I think, fairly clearly found something other people just don't know exists. Right. Unfortunately, Just Rusty continues, this tech isn't fun. And if you were willing to grind more than I did, the ceiling on further high scores would be measured by patience rather than skill if anyone used my method. Okay, pause here for just a sec. So we have a couple of problems already that are building the situation out. This is a complicated parlay. So this is a situation where, unlike my examples previously, it's a memetic hazard where if people knew about this, it's arguably not very fun. Like, it doesn't make the game better. It kind of ruins something that the game could have been fun about. You could think of this, maybe a similar corollary would be like speedrunning. Sometimes a game is fun to speedrun, but you could conceive of a patch that would trivialize part of the speedrun that is kind of interesting. A good amount of the time, patches trivialize parts of a speedrun that are not interesting, and that's great. But obviously it happens sometimes that a patch or even the game being better put together for normal players makes it kind of less interesting to speedrun just as a side effect. And that's because people know about those changes. You know, they know of a way to do this thing, and that makes it, you know, interesting. Or people don't know about tech that will later be uncovered in a speedrunning category, and it's kind of interesting to work around the lack of that information. Sometimes it's more interesting once people realize this new thing you can do, and sometimes it's arguably less interesting. This is a case where you feel like it basically trivializes the game and makes it kind of uninteresting, and just a time dump to get a higher score if people were to know about this thing. Now, here's the kicker. In a game like this, which was put out by a solo dev on a very small time frame and which no longer receives updates, should one unveil the memetic hazard and risk making the game less fun for anyone who knows to use it, or keep it to themselves? As a game designer, I can see multiple theoretical ways to plug the hole, but knowing that plug is never coming, it's hard to know how to respond. And indeed, that's the end of the parlay. You've chosen not to say it in this parlay. Yes, this is an interesting one. So comparing my thesis from earlier in the parlay, I said that I thought it was better to reveal, most of the time, because I want the game to become more like itself, to embrace its design goals, and become aware that there is a way to break them so that it can become not breakable in that way, so that it is itself rather than accidentally kind of becoming something other than what it was trying to do. I just really want to stress, and we're going to get into this a lot more in this parlay, that this is not about what I prefer versus what anyone else prefers. It doesn't matter what I like versus and what anybody else likes. This is about the game's design getting to function. Usually in games where something like this happens, the game design, the work put into the game, the thing the game is, the systems in the game can be bypassed by this strategy. And so I hope we can agree that even if people decide they like what comes out of that, the peculiar way of playing that comes out of that, it does kind of make the game no longer itself. You kind of can't play the game that was there before if you know about this thing. Some of you are probably already objecting, like, can't you just not use that strategy? Well, I'm going to go into a lot of detail about what I think about that in just a few minutes, but the issue is that it doesn't serve the game's design. It's something in the game that doesn't make it more like what it's trying to do. Let's take Monster Hunter as an example. Let's just say that you could do a huge amount of damage by doing that weapon swapping thing I was doing before. That it was not a minor utility benefit, as I would think it is. Valuable, yes, but it does take a little bit of time, and you could argue that were you sufficiently skilled, not unrealistically skilled, you could just do more damage by continuing to attack the monster. I think that's probably true in current Monster Hunter. What if that wasn't true, and you could instead do clearly, easily much more damage by, heavy bowgun can fire on a Sekret, on your mount that you can ride and use to swap weapons during fights. And you could then use that to fight the monster while it's fighting another monster. And Heavy Bowgun can already do something kind of cool, which is you can break wounds and like stun the monster and do significant damage on your Sekret. This isn't useful that often, but it comes up sometimes, which is kind of neat. It's just a little texture that the weapon has. A lot of weapons in Monster Hunter are like this. Sword and Shield can use some items while it's drawn, unlike every other weapon, which has to be put away before you use items. There's just little things like that. That's a normal thing in Monster Hunter. But what if it wasn't, and instead it was way, way strong to fight on your Sekret? Early in the time I was playing Monster Hunter, I tried to make a build where when the monster is fleeing, if it's at low health, you can just finish it off while it's running away from you. And so far it hasn't turned out that well, which I think is good, because if it was like that, that would mean that that setup would save you so much time if the fight wasn't really hard, that it would be kind of inarguable that the game basically becomes about shortening hunts by managing to make the monster not survive fleeing you rather than, like, I don't know, using the weapon you want, basically. I don't think that's good. It's not the end of the world. That one wouldn't be too bad. But I would argue maybe if that came up, making the developers aware so that they can patch it so that you simply cannot hurt the monster. The moment it decides to flee, you can't hurt it anymore. So that the game can be about fighting monsters and not like just doing damage while the monster is awkwardly fleeing from you. Would be better. It would be better because the game is supposed to be fun for fighting monsters this way, and that thing interrupts that experience. Some people might enjoy the gameplay that would result for what it is, for it being its own thing, but it doesn't serve the rest of the design. So the greater good and what makes the rest of the game's design like matter the most, what makes there the most game, I guess to put it that way, would be to remove that from the game. Without knowing exactly what Just Rusty's tech is here, of course, we have to open up the possibility that when Just Rusty says that this tech isn't fun, that is, of course, not possible to be an objective comment. It's possible, though pretty unlikely, that this thing actually would be really fun, and the developer of the game would think, like, oh, this does serve the game's design. After all, I do think there's a small argument to be made that in a game that is a contest of skill, such things are ultimately largely a matter of who gets more time to practice. And so measuring who gets a high score by patience rather than skill, while I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, I hope you can agree that it is kind of a gray area to some extent. But let's just take it as a given that in many cases, I think it's pretty clear that this is a tedious thing to do. It's not really playing the game. You kind of do something else other than engage with the mechanics of the game. And I think this is the sign of something that is probably worth removing from the game. But again, finally, the kicker here is we assume that it essentially cannot be removed. It cannot be removed. So if Just Rusty tells people about this thing, that's it. Like, the game is like this now for people that know about it. People that are enjoying fighting for high scores are now basically not able to do everything in their power to get a high score. They have to pretend that they don't know how to get a high score. And what will happen? Well, a number of people will simply want the fake ego boost of having a high score up there, so they will abuse the tech, and the high score board will become useless to people that want to engage with the previous version of the design. They can play the game as it existed before, but not the way they were playing it before, not with the experience, the end experience they had before. They can't really compete for those top spots the way they were before. And indeed, I would be interested, there's no judgment, I'm just saying this is an effect it would have, how you feel, Just Rusty. Will you stop using this tech or not? You found it and made the point, which I think is useful for this parlay, but will you continue to do this, or will you kind of erase that somehow? It's interesting, like, your high score is higher enough that just the existence of someone who's gotten that much of a higher score suggests that either, I think the most common assumption will be that you cheated somehow, but people who are a little bit savvy about the game will probably start thinking about how you were able to get that high score legitimately, and people with an open enough mind will likely be able to figure out the thing that you found. One argument to reveal the memetic hazard is that a smart player will probably also be able to figure it out. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it is really specific and they probably won't. But That is like one of the only arguments I see in this position to reveal it, is that it will ultimately be revealed anyway. And so if the situation is just on death row in the first place, maybe it's a little bit more likely things will get sorted out if you just tell people, or if you frame the conversation, take control of the situation by saying, I found this thing, let's just agree to not do it, or something. That probably won't work, but might. Whereas if people just kind of find it on their own, it definitely won't work. The situation will devolve, and again, the top will be filled with people who just want to feel like they're better by doing this artificial thing, and the people who want to compete in the skill challenge will no longer be able to be at the top ranks. Probably there's no chance either way, but you could think of it that way. We will get into that a little bit more. Like, I assume you're to some extent asking for actual advice in this discussion. So I will go into that a little bit more. But I do think it's worth taking a detour to get a little bit into, like, is this an issue? I'm aware that many people do not agree that this is a bad thing. Now, I hope I'm not coddling any of you. I guess I've just been surprised to see pretty seemingly well thought out responses to comments like this, where people act like, basically, if you can do anything to kind of avoid or pretend that the thing isn't in the game, then it is therefore completely not a problem at all, and it's irrelevant to discuss removing the thing. And I think that is ridiculous. Like, that's not intellectual to respond to it that way. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is an interesting point. From a game development perspective, what do you do? I suggested before that it's kind of better to have the game be about itself. Does that thing make the game more about itself? Does knowing about this thing in the game make players behave more in line with, like, having fun the way the game is designed to? And therefore, are the developers' efforts to give people that kind of fun being wasted or furthered? And if they're being wasted, it doesn't seem very efficient on a global scale to let the game continue to be about that. It ought to be changed so the game can be about what it is. There are enough games in the world that it just doesn't matter if a game becomes less how one individual player likes it. Games ought to pursue being the best version of themselves, not catering to every random thing that anyone arbitrarily decides they like about them, because there are games that do all of those things. You don't need this game to do that thing. If you want a game where weapon swapping is more valuable, in my Monster Hunter example, there are those. So it seems more useful to humanity for Monster Hunter to not be about that. And it does not matter even the slightest bit what I or anybody else specifically likes about it. It's better for it to be about itself. Or, not that the developers decide that. More like the sum total of what we all enjoy about it decides that. And one individual person saying, I like this about it, is irrelevant. Like, it doesn't matter. Exactly because what other people like about it does matter. Because it is a thing that the game is trying to focus on. And to say that if a thing is avoidable, you can choose not to do it. Technically, you are physically able to not do it. Therefore, there's no point in removing it from the game. Or like maybe some people like it, and therefore there's no point to remove it from the game, is to suggest that a game being focused does not matter. Obviously, that's not true. I think that this is a classic case of people experiencing that they enjoy something or are not bothered by something, but then someone else says they aren't enjoying something or are bothered by something. And people respond in this really frustrating but very understandable way, where they say, well, I've had the experience where it doesn't bother me, so you must be wrong, because I know for sure that my experience where it doesn't bother me is real. I've played, I don't know, let's say someone was really upset about my hunting horn tech in Monster Hunter. I mean, lots of people have come up with that. That's not my tech, but you know what I mean. That thing I mentioned before. Let's say someone was really upset about that. And someone else said, well, I have played Monster Hunter, and I am not bothered by that. So I, this hypothetical person, they're saying, I know for sure that it's real, that I'm not bothered by it. People then do this really stupid, but again, kind of understandable thing, where they then extrapolate and say, that means you aren't bothered by it. Your being bothered by it must be fake, because I know for sure that my not being bothered by it is real. No, this is a difference of perspective. You can easily both be right. The answer is that it's not that it bothers people so much or is the end of the world. It's just, let me put it another way, hypothetical player. But would it be a problem if it was removed? I've heard people often say about things like this, well, I don't do that, but it's fine that other people like to do it, so don't complain about it. And it's like, okay, but listen, so nothing negative would happen to you if it was removed, right? So why is it good to leave it in the game if it bothers this person? If it doesn't bother you, but it bothers them, isn't the greater good to simply not bother them as well? And the answer is yes, in my opinion, clearly yes. I think the other thing that happens is that people think someone is complaining about it, so it's a big deal. Look, no, it's not, but neither is it positive. It's not a big negative, but it's not a big positive to have this hypothetical thing. So why not remove it? Why is it good to keep it in the game? And people seem to be arguing that it's because someone else is saying they enjoy it. People are not the sovereigns of their own enjoyment. People don't just magically arbitrate. They don't have perfect meditative plain knowledge of every single thing they enjoy. Just because someone says they enjoy something does not mean they are now like the hedonic lord and they have perfect mastery of everything they like. It doesn't matter if someone says they enjoy it. If they're going to write you a thesis about why they think it's good game design, well, that's an argument and we could deconstruct it. But simply somebody saying, I like this and therefore I win is not like that. It's fine to just ignore that. It's okay to say that isn't the most important thing in the entire world. It's okay to make a game design decision where someone doesn't like that you've made that game design decision. Or imagine a nega version of Just Rusty here, where they feel like, well, if the developer patches this, they took my high score away. It's like, yes, that's one perspective. Fortunately, you are not the dictator of the entire world, so it only matters a little bit what you think. You are not the only person that matters, obviously. You are one of the people that matter. And everyone else in all of humanity is the rest of the people that matter. So it's good for that to be changed. It seems to me, Just Rusty, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, that you, if in a hypothetical world you could be sure that it would be removed, you would prefer to reveal it and have it be removed, basically. But I would love to hear a follow-up where you say, like, hypothetically, what would I want if I could have any outcome I wanted? Or what will you do now? Or if you decide to tell people or not, no judgment from me. Maybe this is bad of me, but I care even more about being interested in this situation and learning from it than I do about the well-being of this game. I just think there's more for, again, humanity to gain from using this as an experiment than, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be cruel to this poor game, but this relatively smaller priority of this game having a good meta is not as important to me as learning about what to do in these situations. So if you decide to reveal it, I personally don't mind that much. It doesn't matter. We might as well use the situation to learn. And if you decide not to, that would be interesting too. Or what will you decide to do? If you could decide to have any outcome you wanted, what would you want? But as a closing point for this part of the discussion, this point is important to me. This idea that people really have trouble accepting that things in a game that they might like ought to be removed. And I feel like it's that troubles me because it's extremely easy to explain why it's good for those things to be removed. And I guess it's just that people aren't signing up to talk about game design, and that's okay. But we are signing up to talk about game design. So it doesn't really make sense for someone to come in and say, oh, but I like this. So all of your reasoning why a lot of people would enjoy it more if it was like this is somehow moot simply by me saying I enjoyed this thing. Like that, it doesn't matter. Like, sorry, I care about your feelings, but that's the thing about you, and we're trying to make the game better. I just feel like a lot of discussion is stymied by that point, and that's a shame because it can be better that way. Again, I feel like it's not really the end of the world, but it's not beneficial either. So why not just remove it? I think that people seem to think someone is saying it's so bad, so please remove it. No, so don't overreact. It's not like it's this terrible thing. Although in this case, I mean, it seems fairly bad. I don't know. And also that people seem to have this feeling like, well, but you're ruining someone else's fun. You're making it objectively impossible for someone to do this exploit, because you subjectively will not choose to not do this thing. But I don't think that that's really the case. Again, you are subjectively not forcing this person to play this game. Like, that you don't have to play this game. If a person likes a thing in a game that doesn't serve that game's design or fits in with the rest of the game, you are preventing them from doing it in that game, but it's 2025. You can play a game that is about that and enjoy doing that. Now, current humanity isn't very flexible that way, but that doesn't change the logic of the situation. It makes total sense and is completely accessible and applicable for someone to just go do it in a different game. There are plenty of free, even, or inexpensive titles that are like this. I don't think it's a bad idea if this conversation comes up to politely suggest that if you like this thing, but it doesn't seem like it's in the game's design as a whole, maybe you could get more of it by playing this game that exists, for example. Don't be mean, but that could be one solution to discussing this subject. That has been a problem for me many times. Maybe some of you, it has been too. A couple other ways that I have thought about this kind of thing being bad. It's kind of like invisible difficulty options. Or again, in Just Rusty's example, it's kind of like there's a different version of the game that exists if you know about this thing. And it isn't the whole point to compete in the same version of the game. It would be like if some people on the high scoreboard had a different update version of the game. That's clearly not the same type of competition. So if we play competitive Smash, obviously we all need to be on the same version of the game, right? You literally can't not do that. But if there was some way to do that, that would obviously be unfair, and everyone on Earth would agree that we need to play the same version. So why do people suddenly not agree when it's something like this? Again, I feel it's some bug in how the information is presented. And if you reframe it differently, suddenly nobody thinks there should be invisible difficulty options, or that people should be able to compete using different versions of the experience, right? I don't know. Or even in sports where this is kind of a gray area, like making those Nike shoes that made people way faster, the discussion is opened about what to do about them. People don't instantly unilaterally agree to ban them. Some people do think that, but the entire industry doesn't instantly agree to ban them. But there's absolutely no question that we need to discuss it. You see what I mean? Nobody is getting caught up in, oh, but some people like them. That's not relevant. What is the activity about, and does this serve that goal? And in most areas of society, everybody understands this. So maybe it feels too abstract here. Again, I feel like games complicate this because it feels like it's for fun. Like, what's the big deal of it being there? But the logic isn't any different. There's really no reason not to just have it be the fun of the game. Another way to put it is to get to try your hardest. So while technically it is physically possible to play the game and just ignore this tech existing, you can't do the activity that playing the game is for many people, which is trying their hardest, genuinely trying their hardest. So while it appears that the person who is complaining about the thing being in the game could just adapt and do it differently, they actually kind of can't, I would argue. They cannot have the experience of the game they want without doing this additional thing. They can't just engage with the game's systems. Just finally, it occurs to me that this is something where a lot of people kind of think that other people are just whining, like that they don't really care at all about the complaint. They're just saying no one is ever willing to adapt to anything. And instead they just complain about stuff not being just so. Just deal with it. That's fine, but just not relevant. Sure, I do think it's true that people are not sometimes as go-gettery as would be worthwhile. I don't really feel like it's fair to judge people's amount of free time and therefore ability to adapt to that stuff. Something I try to be very careful about doing. But technically, could people often do more to just get their complaint out of the way and make a better version of the system for themselves? Yeah, it often doesn't matter, but sure, I guess. That doesn't mean it isn't, why is it bad for the game and the people whose job it is to adapt the thing to make it easier for them? That's the game developer's job. Why wouldn't it make sense for them to do it instead? Again, I feel like this is just people making arguments from other areas in life. They're frustrated about this attitude generally, but in this specific situation, it doesn't really make sense. And indeed, just because the person happens to be just complaining doesn't mean their argument is invalid. They don't matter. Their argument is what we're talking about. And they might have a bad reason for making the point while having a good point. This is extremely common, in my opinion. Another way to word the old game design adage of players identify problems correctly but are wrong about the solution is to say players are often wrong to be complaining but correct about the complaint. Like that player instantly gets removed from the situation once they bring up their complaint. But that doesn't mean that the thing they're complaining about is wrong. And it's a very valuable skill to be able to say, this comment was given in an incredibly, let's say, for example, disrespectful way about this game. But I'm not somehow prevented from making that maybe good change to the game just because I happened to be given that feedback in a disrespectful way. Like, who cares? It's a great boon to be able to gain things from inconsiderate assholes, isn't it? Kind of a weird way to get back at them is a way I kind of used to think of it. You can learn a lot from the meanest people in the world. You just have to be willing to separate them from what they said. They clearly don't matter. So it's much better to, where was that coming from? Well, from them, maybe it was coming from somewhere kind of weird, but no, it doesn't matter. Who cares about them? They're being an ass. What were they? What is that thing? Why is that coming up? That is a little bit weird that people are like compelled to do this thing in a game, and they could not do it, but who cares? I mean, is it good that the game is compelling people to do this thing? So I don't know. I'm not sure I've been able to convince anyone differently, but this is something I feel pretty strong about. I feel like a lot of good game development is kind of prevented because players are quite immature about this subject. So I thought it was worth tackling. Unfortunately, probably most of you aren't. And while you might disagree with me, you probably don't have that perspective on disagreeing with me, where you're listening to a series all about game design. You probably won't respond by saying it just doesn't matter what you decide. Some of you might disagree with me, but you probably don't have the opinion that it is simply irrelevant what you do. Hopefully in this Lord Rusty example, just Rusty's example here, I mean, we can agree that it matters what they choose to do a little bit, and you just might have a different opinion about which one has what effect. It has an effect what they decide to do, right? So yeah, the the situation is interesting. You were able to construct an example where the simpler solution, I don't think this is usually a very complicated situation in most games, uniquely doesn't apply. You kind of can't just say, reveal it so it can be changed. And when players say, shh, don't tell anyone, I don't want my cool tech to get nerfed. The problem, as I diagnose it in most games, is that they wrongly believe the developer is against fun. And that's just not an intelligent thing to think. Like, that's just wrong, obviously. And the developer might be failing to make the game fun, but there are plenty of games that are not failing to be made fun. Just go play those, I would respond. It's not really that hard to just have a different perspective on it and try something else that you'd like instead. It's interesting though, because developers often have weird verbiage about this. I'm reminded of games like Path of Exile, where the developers often say things in their little releases for an update like, embrace the overpowered and don't worry about balance, when Path of Exile is, I would argue, pretty objectively significantly concerned with balance, and that is good. It makes there be a variety of options in the game, and that is what everybody likes about it. So for them to then say, like, we don't care about that, we just care about power, I can't help but think that they are metagaming and saying something like, we know that doesn't actually make sense, but for the type of player that is concerned with such things, they'll play our game because they'll think that we're not against them having fun, which is true, by not removing fun things because that's what they think balancing, which is stupid. That obviously isn't what balancing is. But if we just say this, they will hear that, and that is what we're trying to say. We're just not saying it in so many words. And then players like me, who think it's stupid for a developer to say we don't care about balance, will think about what they said for a second, because I am not an idiot, I would argue, and will conclude, no, that's not true. They don't think that. And would you look at this? I've suspected that maybe they don't think about balance. Or you know what? Maybe they think they really don't care about balancing things, but they just don't know that they actually are balancing things in practice, and that that's good. It would probably be better if they knew that that was good and that they were doing that, but I mean, it's fine if they just, like, they're talking the talk, but the walk that they walk is a better walk to walk. Okay, yeah, that's weird, but okay. You see what I mean? So I don't know. I think it's an interesting situation, and the example here is unique in that It's one where the game is small, so it's much more possible than it is in most games that nobody else will come up with the thing. The game has a visible leaderboard or some way where other players can know that a player has found something that goes beyond the bounds of the game normally without checking. You can't play the game without seeing this. So this is a game where you don't have to be like on social media or whatever to know about this. Players have a real tendency to say, if a thing is on the Reddit for a game, literally everyone playing the game knows about it because Reddit is public and everybody reads Reddit. But according to the statistics on the matter, objectively, not everybody reads the Reddit. Between maybe 50% and like 20% of a game's player base reads online materials nowadays. So no, they really don't. Tons of players, most players do not know anything on the internet about a game. That baffles players like me, but I believe that those statistics are real. There isn't a reason to think that isn't true. If anything, it's probably actually higher. And somehow people got in there that like check those sources but don't actually use them that much, or like they check them for entertainment, not to gain knowledge about the game. But this is a game where you kind of can't not do that to an extent. Not everybody who sees the leaderboard will conclude that Just Rusty has found tech that other people don't know about, but it's not really possible to not notice that there's an outlier on the leaderboard. Do you see what I mean? The game is small. You kind of can't know that something is up, as it were. The developer is gone, so it can't easily be patched out. You know, it seems like probably not that difficult to remove, you're suggesting, but there just isn't a developer there to remove it. And finally, combine that with 4, it's a competitive environment. And so not only arguably the philosophical point of the game is about making builds, for example, and this thing, if you know about it, reduces the variety of builds. It is pretty clearly one of the game's design goals to have a variety of builds in such a game, so removing that thing would make sense, but it is at least arguable. I don't think it's that arguable, but it is a little bit arguable, like whether that is important for the game. But in this case, it's really not very arguable whether it's important for the game. The game is one narrow thing. You compete in this, first-person arena shooter thing, and you try to get a better score. That's the whole game. So it's pretty indisputable as we can get, that it is like the point of the game to get a higher score. Therefore, it's hard to wipe this away by saying it just doesn't matter. This is in many ways a once in a lifetime perfect example of this subject, which is incredibly cool, by the way. Thank you for making this parlay. That's awesome. So how do we wrap up? It's interesting. Like it would be interesting to hear what one might do in this situation. So I guess I'll speculate. I have been a little bit flippant about, well, people can just play different games. There are infinite games out there. But you do feel like that's not true to a point, You even said early on, this game is kind of in the vein of games like Devil Daggers and Hyperdemon, but more depth than the former and less barriers to entry than the latter, so a really fun entry in this genre, which is not infinite. There are a number of games like this, but it's not true that you can literally handpick any game that has any combination of these mechanics that is physically possible, obviously. I'm not trying to be too hand-wavy about that. I'm just making the point that in many cases, the player's complaint is a pretty broad one. The player's playing a game with a build system, and they like the exploits in the build system that keep getting patched out. They don't consider why those things are being patched out. They like them, so they argue the developer just doesn't care about fun. Without thinking, well, there's a pattern to the things I enjoy. Why don't I seek out a game that is about those things? This game clearly isn't about those things. Why don't I go find another one? I think they've extrapolated that all games developers are against them having fun, or they have this feeling like it's what's fun to them is that the cheating, like the fooling the game, the getting one over on the game. And that is one where it's kind of a separate discussion. I personally feel like that's just a maturity thing, and people will just grow out of that. It's interesting to find these things, but wanting them to stay there is a sort of lack of awareness of the rest of the world existing that I think people will just grow out of. That's not really the same problem as like I actually argue it's good for this to be in the game. That's people just not thinking about whether it's good for it to be in the game and saying, well, I like it. That's the end of my thought process on the subject. Those aren't really the same problems. So I think it's a whole other thing. And Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be interesting to look at more of these. I was happy I was able to think of a few examples, which can be hard to do in Parlay, from myself, like that one from Smash and the Monster Hunter thing. Though, again, I think personally a lot of them are good. I wanted to note as a kind of weird ending to this one that most of the time the final boss of Memetic Hazards, this situation is interesting because it's rare. There's not very many times where I think this is the state of affairs. I gave the example of speedrunning formats before, and there's a lot of documentation on the internet that's pretty interesting to dig into if you're interested in this kind of thing, of speedrunning categories where there was something really annoying about the speedrun, but it was then solved, and then players like did that speedrun category more, or, you know, it became more interesting or something. A lot of the time, this is a good thing, which is kind of interesting. So when we say memetic hazard, I know wording it that way, I mean, and there are problems. That was what the Bionicme parlay was about, and that's why we talked about it that way. But a lot of the time, I think this is actually pretty good, and generally it's better to just experience the game as it is, rather than this sort of impermanent state where you don't know what's going on. I admit this is much more preachy and about my philosophy about games than most parlay are, so I'm going to embrace that and say one more thing, which is that for me, it's also a matter of, I guess I would word it as security. It's like, you've been around the block a few times. I said that the just wanting the thing not to be taken out is kind of immature. And the reason is that it's as if to deny entropy. To be a little highfalutin for a sec, it's like people haven't gotten used to the fact that there are other nice things in the world and things change. It's like when people like a show, an anime, and it's the first one they got into, so people have a tendency to overlook the flaws of the thing, or it's like they're never going to find something like this again. Well, you're never going to have such a limited perspective on things again, no. But you learn as you grow up even a little bit. I'm not trying to act holier than thou. Literally everyone knows this when they're 20, I would hope. It doesn't take much to get to this level of maturity. That there just are lots of wonderful things in the world. So there's really no need to be worried if one of them is gone after a time. Like, that's fine. I have fond memories of many of the exploits or bugs that I played with in Warframe, for example, that were removed. I enjoyed them, and I'm happy they were removed. That's not like uncommon or hard to feel. I don't really see what the problem is in the grand scheme of things. It seems to me like people are just worried they won't get another one, or their unique thing will be gone. And other people play way less games, right? So it's kind of understandable how they feel like their one thing is getting ruined as such. But I'll impress again, I'm not trying to be hand-wavy. There is no reason not to play other games. There is zero reason not to play other games. So for anybody that feels like that, I would implore you, please, I will never ask anything of you this much, play other games. They're often free, they're amazing, the industry is really interesting right now. Go play other stuff. There is no reason not to, and I promise you, you will enjoy everything you do more because you have done that. There just isn't a reason to have that limited perspective, and I think that's where a lot of these arguments come from. To me, I went back to that thing where it's like kind of insecurity inducing to leave these things in the game. It's like that's gonna be changed at some point, or you know, if you have been around the block a few times in life, these things change. So when you see something that, yeah, that probably isn't how it's intended to be, you know, it's kind of like Schrodinger's change. You're gonna wake up one day and it's gonna be changed, or maybe not. And until they do something about it, you'll never know. That thing is kind of on the block forever. And I think if people aren't anxious about that, they're ignorant of it. To be aware of it is, I think, to be waiting for something to happen about it. Maybe I have an anxiety disorder, but who doesn't? I propose. So personally, the reason that I like it to be this way is that games can progress toward their kind of final form as well. Sometimes people don't believe in this. Like, if the game develops for long enough, it will sort of like get there, or sort of complete in a way. This is possible. Games can find their footing and just kind of, you've done it. Like, this is a good stopping point for this game. I admit that's not common, but if you play games that, release with a cycle of patches and then they stop getting releases or patches, they often hit a point where, yeah, like, it's pretty arguable that this was a good stopping point for the game. Hades 1 comes to mind. While I don't think it's perfect, I feel like the place they stopped, especially if they knew they were going to make Hades 2, kind of makes sense. Like, to develop the systems further would be to tackle a whole new project, and they planned to do that, so why not just do it there instead? The game kind of had problems or things they wanted to tweak, and then it didn't have those same problems. And what remains are compromises because of those design decisions, not things that are objectively wrong as per se, or things they would have in some other timeline wisely invested resources into. It just kind of, this was the result of that game development. It's not perfect as a result, but it means there is kind of an end to all these changes. I think that people who play a lot of live service games don't realize this, genuinely think, well, it's just going to be a game of cat and mouse of the developer deleting things I find fun forever. But I mean, it's not. For one thing, you could just not play games that get patches forever, and then it definitely won't be a game of cat and mouse forever because the patches will stop. There won't be any more of them. So again, I hope it doesn't sound dismissive. It is really worth discussing that there is a way around these types of concerns, though it doesn't really apply specifically to just Rusties. I hope I was able to do a parlay that effectively balanced this incredibly interesting specific example and the concept in general, why people seem so resistant to this idea, and maybe what can be done about it. What are solutions or ways to discuss this with people that are about game design, instead of just arguing that my perspective is that this doesn't bother me and therefore I don't want to have this discussion, but confusingly I am participating in it anyway. Like, okay, but could you just not? Can we talk about it or not talk about it instead of you being a sort of superposition of talking about it? And hopefully that arms you, as it did me. I learned something from this parlay about what I think about this, to go forth and experience this. And just Rusty, again, while it's no pressure, I would be happy to hear more about this situation if you have more to share. Thanks for bringing it up. What a great example. Folks, if you want to share something like this or something totally unrelated and different, we'd love to have you. Sometimes the best examples are the most weird and niche rather than these perfectly crafted moments. You don't know how unique the thing you have to share is until you try. We'd love to have you aboard. Links in the description if you want to join us here. Looking forward to the next one.